Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through something that might sound utterly ridiculous at first. How rich Victorians decorated their bedpans. Yes, you heard that right. We're going to tiptoe, ever so delicately, into the world of gilded, hand-painted, porcelain toilets. Because even nature's calls were not exempt from the Victorian obsession with status, ornamentation, and just the right touch of pretentious flair. Right now, you're standing in a velvet-draped Victorian bedroom. The gas lights are dimmed, the scent of rosewater lingers faintly in the air, and under the grand mahogany bed, nestled just behind a pair of embroidered slippers, rests a porcelain bedpan. Not just any bedpan, this one is gleaming ivory white, delicately painted with violet garlands, rimmed in gold, and stamped with the crest of a prominent family. As absurd as it may sound, it's actually quite beautiful. You almost don't want to imagine what it's used for. Almost. And yet, here's your first cheeky little reality check. You probably wouldn't survive one night in a Victorian bedroom. Between the corsets, coal fumes, and chamber pot duties, let's just say it wasn't quite as romantic as the period dramas make it look. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to let me know your local time and where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing the weird variety of night owls that gather here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably heard about Victorian formality, the corsets, calling cards, those 100 different forks at dinner. But what rarely gets mentioned is how deeply that formality extended into the most personal corners of daily life. Hygiene, bodily functions, even the stuff we usually prefer to flush and forget. In an era before indoor plumbing was common, bedpans, more delicately referred to as chamber pots, were an unavoidable necessity. But if you had enough money, even those humble items became objects of art and status. Early in the Victorian period, most people, yes, even the wealthy, relied on chamber pots for their nighttime needs. Running water and indoor toilets were not yet widespread luxuries. Even in stately homes, it was common to keep a pot under the bed, sometimes hidden inside a decorative cabinet called a commode, which is where we get that charming euphemism today. But where the lower classes had to make do with cheap metal or clay pots, the upper crust had other ideas. Porcelain became the material of choice for wealthy Victorians. Smooth, elegant, easy to clean, well, relatively speaking, and, perhaps most importantly, decorative. Fine porcelain from English potteries like Wedgwood or imported from Limoges in France was suddenly a perfectly acceptable canvas for artistic flair, even if its final destination was your posterior. One mainstream historical fact you should know: by the mid-1800s, Britain was home to dozens of major pottery factories, especially in the Stoke-on-Trent region. These factories produced not only dinnerware and teacups but also highly ornate chamber pots for elite clients. These pots were often custom-ordered to match an existing household set, or better yet, to outshine the neighbors. But why would anyone want a bedpan to be beautiful? Well, think of it like this. When everything in your home screams wealth, your wallpaper, your carpets, your servants' uniforms, you don't want to break the spell with a rusty old pot. Even private moments had to reflect taste and refinement. The Victorians had an intense fear of being seen as vulgar or uncouth, and that anxiety extended to every room in the house, even the most private ones. Let's pause for a moment to admire the absurdity. You're a Victorian aristocrat in the middle of the night, lighting a candle, slipping out from under a brocade quilt, and squatting over a china vessel that features your family crest and a ring of painted forget-me-nots. And you paid extra for those forget-me-nots. Some scholars still argue whether these decorative choices were more about aesthetics or function. Was the glossy porcelain actually easier to clean and maintain? Or was it all just for show? There's some evidence to support both. What's undeniable is that the richer you were, the more likely your chamber pot was part of a matched bedroom suite, one where even your waste vessel had coordinating flourishes. Here's a quirky little fringe tidbit to keep in your back pocket. In certain houses, bedpans were displayed on open shelves as part of a vanity or sideboard, especially in the bedrooms of ladies who entertained female guests for long chats. Some pots were disguised as ornamental jars or had dual uses, doubling as basins or decorative urns when not in use. It's like a weird game of historical hide-and-seek. Guess which one's secretly a toilet? By the 1850s, the wealthier Victorians also began ordering custom paint jobs for their chamber pots. Some featured pastoral scenes, others abstract floral patterns, and a few went the extra mile with biblical motifs. Imagine a pot showing the Garden of Eden. How's that for ironic placement? The obsession with beauty and control extended even to the act of relieving oneself. And it wasn't just for the guests or the household head. Rich children had their own miniature versions, often painted with cheerful scenes or animals to make the process more pleasant. Ah yes, the Victorian solution to potty training: distract them with hand-painted kittens. The aesthetics weren't limited to visual design either. Some high-end pots came with lids, padded, quilted, or even satin-lined lids, to muffle sound and keep odors at bay. Lavender sachets or rose petals were often tucked underneath to help disguise the inevitable. Because if there's one thing Victorians feared more than scandal, it was the smell of shame. In some circles, it was even a point of whispered gossip. Who had the prettiest pot? Who imported theirs from Paris? Who, heaven forbid, was still using a basic tin one? It's hard to believe now, but chamber pots were part of the unspoken social checklist, filed under things we don't talk about but absolutely judge you for. There's something deeply telling about this. The Victorian era is often romanticized as a time of strict morals, chivalry, and intellectual progress. But at its heart, it was also an era of deep insecurity and social performance. Even the act of going to the bathroom had to fit the aesthetic. The decorated bedpan, then, becomes a weirdly perfect symbol of the age, elegant on the surface, uncomfortably repressed beneath. So as you lie there now, maybe tucked into your own blanket, just imagine reaching under the bed, not for a forgotten sock or a dust bunny, but for a weighty, artistically crafted chamber pot, hand-painted with tulips and lined with mother-of-pearl. Then remember, someone actually chose that design. With care. And here's your final little chuckle for this section. Some of these antique bedpans, those finely decorated nighttime companions, have found their way into modern museums. They sit behind glass, quietly dignified, as though waiting for one last royal behind to rest above them. So now that you've peered beneath the bed skirts of Victorian society and spotted a porcelain surprise shimmering in the candlelight, it's time to step deeper into the ornate world of bedpan design. Because believe it or not, those floral-painted, gold-rimmed little pots didn't appear overnight. Like all strange things in history, they evolved, gradually, purposefully, and with no shortage of artistic drama. Welcome to the rise of the decorative chamber pot. Let's rewind a bit, just to orient ourselves. Before the 19th century, chamber pots were basically what you'd expect. Plain, utilitarian vessels, often made of cheap earthenware, metal, or even wood. Function, not form, was the priority. They were simple and did the job. No frills, no flair. But then something happened. The Industrial Revolution surged forward, wealth expanded, the middle and upper classes ballooned in numbers, and suddenly everything, including how you went to the bathroom, had to be fashionable. You could say this is where things started to go downhill, or uphill, depending on your aesthetic standards. By the early Victorian period, around the 1840s, chamber pots were starting to reflect the tastes of their owners. And not subtly, either. Patterns, colors, textures, all were on the table. Well, technically under the table, but you get the idea. The moment manufacturers realized there was a market for deluxe toiletware, they leaned in hard. Just like with teacups and wash basins, entire catalogues sprang up offering tasteful, refined chamber pots for the discerning gentleman or lady. And oh, how discerning they were. It started with simple embellishments. A bit of color on the rim, maybe a leaf or two curling along the base. Then came the more elaborate motifs, English roses climbing up the sides, blue and white chinoiserie scenes, delicate gold threading. It wasn't long before these pots were nearly indistinguishable from the household's dinnerware, which, if you think about it, is mildly horrifying. But hey, no one ever accused the Victorians of being too practical. One mainstream historical fact worth knowing here: the late 1800s saw a boom in mass-produced ceramics, thanks to improved kiln technology and the proliferation of pottery centers across Europe. This allowed artisans to produce intricate designs faster and more affordably. Suddenly, even moderately wealthy households could afford decorative pots. And just like that, the race to impress began. What's fascinating, if a bit absurd, is how these decorative pieces became subtle indicators of social class. Having a plain chamber pot said, "We're just getting by." Having a pot adorned with a Rococo-inspired pastoral scene, that said, "We've arrived." And of course, if your chamber pot matched your bedroom drapes, well, you clearly had a decorator, and possibly no real problems. But let's not forget the Victorians were obsessed with propriety. These weren't people who would shout their wealth from the rooftops. Instead, they whispered it into every object. Even their toiletware had to be refined, tasteful, and ideally something your guests would never see. But if they did, it better make the right impression. Now here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some chamber pots weren't just decorated, they were signed. Yes, artisans and factory marks sometimes graced the bottoms of these pieces. Much like a painting. You could flip over your pot and see Wedgwood, Minton, or some other famous pottery name stamped proudly there. It's almost like owning a limited edition designer handbag, except it's something you pee in at night. Some scholars still debate whether these marks were intended for the consumer or just a manufacturing necessity. Either way, they've become extremely valuable to modern collectors. Apparently, you can tell a lot about a person by what's underneath their pot. Now that's a sentence you didn't think you'd hear tonight. But back in the Victorian era, the designs just kept getting more elaborate. Some chamber pots even told stories. Imagine lifting the lid and finding a full countryside scene. Shepherds, lambs, a cottage, all delicately hand-painted inside the bowl. Or perhaps you'd find a humorous caricature tucked into the bottom, ready to greet you when you finished your business. That's right, some of these pots had inside jokes. Literally. Quite the surprise at 3 in the morning, we'd imagine. Even better, there were bedpans that doubled as conversation starters. Not openly, of course. This wasn't the sort of thing you discussed at high tea. But behind closed doors, especially among women, it wasn't unusual for the pot's design to be commented on, gently, obliquely. "Oh, have you seen Lady Weatherby's new Delft pot? Quite inspired." It was code, like a secret handshake of the elite. There was also a quiet industry of gifting going on. Believe it or not, fancy chamber pots were sometimes given as wedding gifts. Not as a joke, mind you, but in earnest. A hand-painted, monogrammed pot was considered thoughtful, a sign of care and refinement. Imagine registering for one at a bridal shop today. "Yes, we'll take the rose-trimmed one with the golden handle, please. Matching bidet if available." But all of this was rooted in a deeper truth about Victorian culture, a belief that beauty and control were linked. If your environment was orderly and beautiful, then so were you. Even your private moments had to reflect harmony. No detail was too small, and certainly no object was too unimportant to be improved. And let's not forget the influence of gender roles. For Victorian women, especially upper-class ones, maintaining the household's appearance was part of their social duty. That included everything from drawing room arrangements to the design of chamber pots. In fact, there's a bit of a scholarly debate about whether these decorative pots were more commonly associated with women's bedrooms than men's. Some argue women had more say in bedroom aesthetics, and therefore their pots tended to be more ornate. Others point out that men, too, had elaborate setups, especially if they were bachelors eager to impress. In either case, the message was the same: refinement, even in the loo. Here's your joke for this stretch. There's a reason Victorians called the bathroom the water closet. It's because calling it the ornately gilded chamber of secret ceramic wonders just didn't roll off the tongue. Now, as we edge closer to midnight, or whenever you're listening, picture yourself as a guest in a Victorian manor. You've been given a guest room with thick velvet curtains, a brass bedstead, and a discreet cabinet in the corner. You open it and find your chamber pot, gleaming with painted pansies and the faint scent of lavender. Congratulations, you're living the dream. Just don't forget to ring the servant bell when you're done. Someone has to empty that thing. But seriously, that brings us to a curious point: the Victorian relationship with servants and privacy. You see, no matter how fancy your pot was, someone else was usually responsible for cleaning it. That job often fell to maids, who had to do it quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention to what they were carrying. It's one of the stranger ironies of the era. The object became more beautiful, but the labor remained just as unpleasant. There are even stories, unconfirmed, but delightfully plausible, of households where the chamber pot was passed discreetly through hidden servant doors or placed on dumb waiters to be taken away. Imagine a little pulley system designed just for transporting floral-themed bedpans. Now that's what I call high society. Of course, not every decorative pot was used regularly. Some were purely symbolic or reserved for special occasions, like when guests stayed over or when the mistress of the house was recovering in bed. A particularly elegant pot might be used to convey tenderness, luxury, or status, even during illness. In that sense, it wasn't just about decor, it was a kind of silent care. And that's what makes the rise of decorative chamber pots so strange and fascinating. It's not just a tale of porcelain and paint, it's a story of human pride, fear, and the relentless need to impress, even in the dark hours of the night. Because when you strip away the corsets and etiquette manuals, the Victorians were just like us, weird, a little insecure, and trying their best to look classy while doing things nobody wants to talk about. So next time you see an antique pot in a museum, or, heaven help you, in someone's collection, remember, you're not just looking at bathroom wear. You're peeking into a whole culture of beauty, decorum, and strange little secrets. And yes, some of them had roses painted inside. You're settling in now, maybe a little deeper under your blanket, as we continue our moonlit tour of Victorian porcelain absurdities. So far, you've seen how chamber pots graduated from crude necessity to artistic statement. But tonight, you're about to learn that those decorations, they weren't always just pretty pictures. No, sometimes, they were whispering things. Not literally, thankfully, but symbolically. Because in the grand, overly buttoned-up drama of Victorian life, even a floral pattern on a bedpan might carry a secret message. Let's begin with something delicate: violets. In Victorian flower language, floriography, as they rather fancifully called it, violets symbolized modesty. So, if your chamber pot featured a trailing garland of violets around the inner rim, that might have been more than just artistic choice. It could have been a nod to decency, to discretion. Yes, we all know what this is for, the pot seemed to say, but let's pretend it's all terribly modest. This might sound ridiculous now, but floriography was a huge deal back then. Victorians were all about coded communication. A bouquet wasn't just a bouquet, it was a whole sentence, sometimes a whole argument, depending on which flowers you included. A red rose said love. A yellow one, jealousy. Daisies were innocence. Lilies were purity. And if someone sent you a bunch of marigolds, well, you probably owed them an apology. This obsessive symbolism didn't stop with bouquets. It leaked into wallpaper, china patterns, jewelry, and yes, even into the designs on chamber pots. So a woman receiving a pot decorated with forget-me-nots might read it as an intimate gesture from a spouse. Even when you're indisposed, it might suggest you are remembered. Romantic? Maybe. Bizarre? Absolutely. But that was the Victorian way. Now for your mainstream historical fact. Entire books were published on flower meanings during the 19th century. The Language of Flowers was a bestseller multiple times under different editions. These guides became essential reading for any socialite who didn't want to accidentally declare war by sending the wrong bloom to the wrong lady. So it's no wonder that these messages seeped into other parts of decorative design, like the floral swirls painted onto the inside of an elite family's night pot. But wait, it gets better. Some chamber pots weren't just floral, they were poetic. In rare cases, especially among eccentric aristocrats, you could find pots with tiny verses painted inside them. A gentle rhyme, usually a pun, tucked right at the bottom of the bowl. Imagine this: you finish your business, look down, and there's a little couplet that says, "Though my use is quite obscure, I serve with grace, both rich and poor." Isn't that lovely? Or odd? Probably both. These rhymes were part of a quiet tradition of humor, and often reflected the private personality of the owner. A serious-faced Victorian might never crack a smile in public, but in the privacy of their chamber, they might chuckle to themselves at a witty verse hidden in porcelain glaze. It was like having a toilet with a personality, a Victorian toilet with a sense of humor. Somehow that makes it even more unsettling. Here's your fringe tidbit for this section. There was actually a small market for mystery pots. These were chamber pots with painted lids that concealed surprise designs or messages underneath, revealed only when opened. Some were sweet, but others leaned into mild mischief. One preserved example includes a sweet pastoral landscape on the outside and, inside, a caricature of a rival politician seated on a privy. Because nothing says, "I despise this man," quite like relieving yourself over his painted likeness. This brings us to the delightful world of satire. You see, not all Victorians were straight-laced moralists. Plenty had a wicked sense of humor, and those with the means to commission bespoke items weren't above getting cheeky with their chamber pots. In fact, some historians argue that these designs were a way to quietly rebel against social norms. You couldn't say certain things aloud in polite society, but you could paint them inside a toilet. That leads us to one of the more debated points in scholarly circles. Were these coded messages, floral symbols, and jokes intended to be seen often? Or were they more like private amusements? Some scholars suggest that the pot's design was mostly for the owner's eyes and served as a sort of comfort, an indulgence in an otherwise stiff, structured world. Others argue that because chamber pots were sometimes seen by servants or close companions, the designs functioned as subtle status markers or even conversation starters in hushed tones. And let's not forget, not all these pots were kept under beds. In wealthier homes, chamber pots were placed inside custom-made wooden cabinets, called pot cupboards or commodes. These were often beautifully crafted, blending seamlessly with bedroom furniture. Some had marble tops, curved doors, and space for matching pitchers or soap dishes. You'd open the door, and there it was, a porcelain pot with violets around the rim and a cheeky poem waiting to greet you. Of course, you weren't supposed to talk about it, which makes it all the more entertaining that some did. Here's a quick laugh for you. One surviving chamber pot from the 1860s features a painted message inside that simply reads, "Tally-ho," the traditional British fox hunting cry. What it meant in that context, we'll leave to your imagination. But even among all this symbolism, let's not forget that many of these designs were purely artistic. Some were crafted by famous ceramicists who viewed them as legitimate works of art. One Wedgwood pot, dated around 1875, features an elaborate neoclassical border, complete with Greco-Roman figures and architectural motifs. Because nothing says class like using the loo surrounded by toga-wearing deities. At this point, You might be asking, why go to all this trouble? And the answer lies in that peculiar Victorian blend of modesty and pride. They believed in elevating the mundane. If something was necessary, then it should be beautiful. And if something was beautiful, it was a reflection of one's character. So in some roundabout way, a well-designed chamber pot became a sign of inner virtue, or at least taste. That's why these pots weren't hidden in dusty corners. They were given display-worthy designs. Some were even kept on dressers in decorative boxes, covered in doilies, or adorned with tassels. The line between toiletware and home decor got blurry, and honestly, a little weird. But it makes perfect sense in the context of Victorian culture. Polish the outside, repress the inside. And speaking of repressed, let's not forget the strict codes of privacy that wrapped around everything related to bodily functions. This was a time when even table legs were sometimes covered with little skirts, lest their nakedness cause offense. So you can imagine how delicately one had to handle the discussion of chamber pots. Here's another small debate among historians. Did the symbolism on the pots evolve over time, reflecting shifts in social attitudes? Some suggest that as the century wore on and plumbing became more common, the pots became more decorative, less practical. They became relics, ceramic fossils of a former way of life. As flushing toilets appeared in urban homes, the painted chamber pot became a novelty, a token of nostalgia. But for a while, especially during the golden mid-century, they were everywhere. And each one told a story. Sometimes funny, sometimes elegant, sometimes deeply strange. But always, always personal. So here we are, lying in bed together, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about hidden messages painted inside toilets. Funny how history does that to you. But before we end tonight's gentle trip into floral symbolism and ceramic mischief, one last image to take with you. A young Victorian bride, newly married, opening her wedding gifts. Among them, wrapped in tissue and tied with a satin bow, a porcelain chamber pot. Inside, a single hand-painted forget-me-not, and a tiny message, "For your most private moments, may they always be lovely." Let's be honest, you probably never expected a bedtime story to include the phrase "gilded flushes." Yet here we are, and tonight, your dreamscape is dusted in gold. Because if there was one thing rich Victorians could never resist, it was turning even their chamber pots into symbols of status. And what better way to do that than by adding actual gold to the place you most definitely do not want to misfire? Yes, this section is all about gold trim and the gloriously unnecessary opulence that is the gilded chamber pot. Just imagine it, the flickering candlelight catching the shimmering edge of your bedpan, casting delicate reflections onto the bedroom wallpaper. Because clearly, your lower half deserves luxury, too. And if this sounds over the top, well, welcome to Victorian England. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. Gilding ceramics was already an established practice long before the Victorians got their hands on it. As early as the 18th century, potteries across Europe had been using gold leaf and gold-based paints to elevate everyday ceramics into objets d'art. This was common on vases, plates, tea sets, but it didn't take long for wealthy Victorians to look around and think, you know what else could use some sparkle? A chamber pot. Now, there's a difference between something being practical and something being absurdly extra, and gilded chamber pots exist proudly on the latter end of that spectrum. These weren't just edged in gold, they were often fully rimmed, with swirling handles, monogrammed initials, and even little golden scrolls painted around the base, just in case someone glanced under your bed and needed a reason to be impressed. But here's where things get especially interesting. The gold wasn't always just on the outside. Oh no. Some pots were gilded on the inside rim as well. That's right. When you lifted the lid, you were greeted by a glittering surprise. A little moment of joy. A sparkle of opulence. A reminder that even your bodily functions were being carried out in style. Fringe tidbit time. Some of the most extravagant chamber pots were designed with solid gold-plated lids. These were not just decorative, They were symbolic. Gilded lids were a luxury reserved for the most elite families, particularly those who entertained royalty or housed important guests. There are recorded instances of aristocratic households commissioning one-of-a-kind chamber pots specifically for a visiting duke or duchess. Because if your furniture isn't brown-nosing, what is it even doing? It wasn't just British aristocracy, either. The French, ever fond of flamboyance, embraced the practice with flair. French porcelain manufacturers like Sèvres and Limoges became popular among upper-class Victorians, and their chamber pots often featured detailed gold tracery, floral scrollwork, and family emblems, all painstakingly painted by hand. These pots weren't just tools, they were trophies. Tiny, intimate monuments to wealth and refinement. And of course, you had to be careful with them. Gilded chamber pots were delicate. Gold leaf is notoriously fragile, so these weren't exactly the kind of pots you'd haul down to the servants' quarters for daily use. Some were ceremonial, if you can believe it, more for show than function. Like the antique Caillou d'Anti drive equivalent of the 19th century bathroom scene. One scholar, a ceramic historian with an arguably unfortunate specialty, has pointed out that the presence of excessive gold work on some surviving pots suggests they were rarely, if ever, used. These were status symbols first and functional objects second. Some may never have been christened, so to speak. They were there to say, I could relieve myself in this if I wanted to, but I have people for that. Now, here's a bit of scholarly debate that adds another layer to this sparkly madness. Some argue that gilded chamber pots were part of a larger attempt to sanitize the image of waste. By decorating something inherently taboo, the Victorians were psychologically softening the harshness of the bodily realities they worked so hard to suppress. Turn your pot into a golden chalice, and suddenly it doesn't seem so base. Others argue the opposite, that the decoration wasn't about masking anything, but about elevating everything. If beauty is moral, as many Victorians believed, then making the mundane beautiful was a moral act. Hence the roses, the poetry, and yes, the gold. This is where things get particularly awkward. Some surviving chamber pots include religious imagery alongside gold detailing. No, you're not hallucinating. There are documented examples of pots that featured angels, churches, and even Bible verses, gilded in gold and painted right on the surface. Let's just take a moment to imagine being the artist hired to paint cherubs on the inside of a pot destined for the Duchess of Whimsyshire's backside. You're welcome. And of course, these weren't the only uses of precious materials. Some chamber pots were inlaid with mother-of-pearl handles. Others had silver filigree detailing around the base. A few had tiny gemstone insets. Yes, gemstones. Because nothing screams elegance quite like urinating into a vessel that sparkles like a Feyberge egg. Let's pause for a joke here. Can you imagine the insurance paperwork? Item: 1 decorative chamber pot, containing approximately 16 grams of 24-karat gold trim and a suspicious amount of self-regard. Now let's talk craftsmanship. You might think decorating chamber pots was a thankless job. But among certain ceramic artisans, it was actually a point of pride. Not everyone got to work on deluxe items. The most skilled workers were often assigned to the finer pieces, and these included, oddly enough, chamber pots. In factory records from Minton and Royal Worcester, skilled enamelless and gold leaf artisans were paid more when working on gilded luxury items, which often included pieces meant for royal or noble homes. To these artists, it wasn't just toilet wear, it was art. And it required just as much precision and creativity as the more traditional decorative items they produced. Here's a fun, quiet tragedy of the modern antique world. Many of these gilded chamber pots are now misidentified in auctions. Because of their beauty and lack of context, some are labeled as flower bowls or decorative vases. Which is probably what their owners would have preferred anyway. And yes, some collectors today know exactly what they're buying. There's even a niche community of antique bathroomware collectors, Some serious, some ironic, all probably very fun at dinner parties. As plumbing systems advanced and flush toilets became widespread in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these golden vessels lost their function but gained rarity. They were boxed up, passed down, or more commonly forgotten in attics. It's only in the last few decades that museums and collectors have started to take them seriously, partly because of their craftsmanship, and partly because, let's face it, it's just too bizarre to ignore. And while the world has moved on, the spirit of those gilded pots lingers. You can still see their influence in modern design. Think of all the overly fancy bathroom accessories available today: gold-plated toilet paper holders, marble soap dishes, bidets with Bluetooth. The echo of the Victorian urge to glamorize even the humblest moments still whispers through high-end bathrooms across the world. So next time you pass a designer sink or spot a monogrammed towel and think, "Isn't that a bit much?" just remember, somewhere, in the flickering candlelight of a 19th century estate, a chamber pot gleamed softly with gold. And someone, somewhere, actually thought, "Yes, that's what my behind deserves." By now, you're well acquainted with the idea that Victorians had no problem pouring money, artistry, and emotional energy into things most people today would rather not think about, namely, their bedpans. But this next layer takes things global. That's right, we're leaving behind the foggy streets of London and setting sail to explore how rich Victorians looked far beyond their own country's borders when it came to even the most private furnishings. Tonight, we enter the era of imported elegance, when chamber pots became a miniature United Nations of porcelain, paint, and prestige. You see, in the Victorian mind, nothing said sophistication quite like foreign luxury. Having something that was not made in Britain, that was an exotic flourish, a sign of travel, refinement, and wealth. You weren't just rich, you were cultured. This obsession extended to clothing, tea, furniture, and yes, the quiet, unassuming chamber pot. Or not so quiet, really, when you consider how loudly some of these imports screamed, "I have more money than you." One mainstream historical fact to kick us off. By the 1850s, the expansion of global trade routes, driven by British imperialism and the rise of steamships, meant that imported goods were pouring into Europe like never before. Silks from China, spices from India, and porcelain from, you guessed it, France, China, and Japan. The Victorians adored Chinese ceramics, not only for their quality but for the air of mystique they carried. A Chinese porcelain pot was not just a toileting tool, it was a conversation piece. Albeit a conversation whispered very quietly, perhaps only after sherry and in very understanding company. In fact, some of the finest imported pots weren't even designed for that purpose initially. Rich Victorians would repurpose large Chinese or Japanese porcelain bowls, usually used for tea ceremonies or temple offerings, into chamber pots. Imagine that. A vessel once intended for sacred rites now serving under Lady Haversmither's four-poster bed. Cultural appropriation? Definitely. Functional irony? Unmatched. And of course, these imports didn't come cheap. The cost of a Chinese export porcelain pot could exceed that of a decent upright piano, which means some families had a literal fortune sitting beneath their mattress, one they'd rather you not ask about during the garden party. Now, let's drift across the Channel to France. French porcelain, especially from Limoges and Sevres, had long been the gold standard for European aristocracy. With its creamy white texture and incredibly detailed hand-painted designs, it became a darling of the Victorian elite. French manufacturers caught on quickly that English clients were willing to pay handsomely for decorative pieces, even for chamber pots, and started producing elegant, gilded versions explicitly for export. Some were decorated with pastoral scenes, others with Rococo-style swirls and cherubs, and a few brave souls went with French erotic art. Yes, there were chamber pots featuring sensual paintings, delicately hidden inside the bowl. These were not openly displayed, unless you were that kind of eccentric, but they existed. Rumor has it one belonged to a certain earl with a fondness for risque poetry and a very understanding housekeeper. That brings us to our fringe tidbit for the evening. There's a chamber pot in a private collection, believed to be from the 1870s, decorated with an almost impressionist-style landscape and signed by a now famous French painter. The artist's name? Still debated. Some say it was a young Renoir. Others argue it's just a very good imitation. Either way, the idea that one of the founders of Impressionism may have painted a chamber pot? Deliciously scandalous. What's even more intriguing is that importing such items wasn't just about taste, it was about identity. Displaying a French or Chinese pot suggested you were worldly. You weren't merely English. You were continental. You understood aesthetics, appreciated foreign design, and, most importantly, had the kind of household where even the hidden parts gleamed with elegance. Let's touch on a scholarly debate here. Some historians argue that these imported items signaled an underlying insecurity within the British upper classes. That beneath their imperial pride lay a quiet anxiety, one soothed by surrounding themselves with items from older, wiser cultures. There's a theory that this was particularly true with objects used in intimate or taboo areas of life, like hygiene. By borrowing designs from other nations, Victorians cloaked their discomfort in foreign charm. Others pushed back, insisting it was simply fashion. That once Queen Victoria herself received imported French china, which she did, everyone else followed suit, desperate to emulate the throne. After all, if Her Majesty relieved herself into a gold-rimmed French pot, what excuse did you have not to? Of course, not all imports were decorative. Some were purely functional, and even those were dressed up. Japanese porcelain, for instance, was renowned for its durability and heat retention. Some bedpans were imported specifically for use with invalids or the elderly, and featured floral blue glazes or subtle crane patterns. Again, it's that strange Victorian logic: if someone's confined to bed, they deserve aesthetic dignity in every moment. And yes, even the travel pots got the foreign treatment. Affluent Victorians traveling abroad might bring portable pots with them, often in custom-fitted leather cases lined with silk. Some of these were imported from Italy, known for their fine leatherwork and compact design. Imagine a tiny, foldable bedpan, its base made of Venetian enamel, tucked inside a velvet-lined box, ready for use at a moment's notice. Here's your laugh for the section. One aristocratic woman allegedly brought her own chamber pot on a grand tour of Europe and insisted it be unpacked in every hotel suite before anything else. According to letters, she called it Margaret, and her servants referred to it with an alarming degree of reverence. Whether Margaret ever saw much action is unclear, but one thing's for sure, that pot travelled in more style than most people of the era. But even imported items had to match. If you were truly devoted to domestic harmony, your French or Chinese pot needed to complement your wallpaper, your curtains, and your chaise lounge. Some decorators specialized in integrating foreign chamber pots into a British aesthetic, adding hand-painted embellishments to make them feel at home. A bit of a fern leaf here, a splash of English rose there, perfectly camouflaged elegance. So, by now you may be thinking, all this for a bathroom object? And yes, that's exactly the point. To the Victorians, privacy didn't mean neglect. If something was personal, it had to be perfect. That included shape, pattern, color, origin. Everything mattered. And the more layers of subtle prestige you could layer onto an object, imported glaze, gold trim, floral meaning, the more it fed the quiet competitive current that buzzed beneath every wealthy household. A chamber pot wasn't just a pot. It was a cultural artifact, a whispered symbol, a lowly object dressed in the trappings of empire. The French might have sent the glaze. The Chinese, the porcelain. The English, the need to hide it under an ottoman and pretend it wasn't there. And as you curl deeper into your pillow tonight, think about this. Somewhere, 150 years ago, someone sat in a gilded four-poster bed, relieved themselves into a Japanese enameled bowl hand-painted in Florence, and thought, "Ah, perfection." Now that you've had your fill of matching motifs and gold-gilded porcelain secrets, it's time to peer into one of the most bewildering and oddly charming aspects of Victorian bedpan culture: themed sets and seasonal collections. Yes, we're about to enter the realm where chamber pots weren't just decorative or personalized, but part of an ongoing lifestyle of curated toiletware. Because if one exquisitely adorned pot was good, then surely a whole collection of them, color-coded, seasonally appropriate, and occasion-specific, was far better. Let's drift gently into another Victorian boudoir, this time in early spring. The fire has gone out for the night, the windows are slightly cracked to let in the damp chill, and in the far corner, discreetly tucked inside a soft leather cabinet, is a chamber pot painted with lilies of the valley. Its rim is edged in a delicate baby blue. Why? Because it's the April pot, of course. This is not an exaggeration. Among the upper crust of Victorian society, the habit of rotating home decor by season was well established. Heavier rugs came out for winter, lighter curtains for spring, darker floral wallpaper got covered with pale-toned fabric panels in the summer. And with each new seasonal arrangement, certain households changed out their chamber pots accordingly. One mainstream historical fact: the Victorians were obsessed with the calendar. From holiday customs to mourning attire, nearly everything in upper-class life followed a seasonal rhythm. The same logic that dictated your outfit, lighter colors for summer, darker for winter, black for mourning, also began to influence home accessories, including those of a very private nature. And when it came to chamber pots, this meant themed sets. Households with serious money might own 4 full sets of chamber pots, one for each season. Each set coordinated with that season's linens, drapes, and rugs. The spring collection might feature budding flowers and pastel colors. Summer pots might showcase sunflowers, roses, or butterflies. Autumn brought leaves, harvest motifs, and richer golds. Winter, predictably, leaned into holly, snowflakes, pine cones, and, on at least one preserved example, a tiny hand-painted robin wearing a scarf. No, really. But the themed collections didn't stop at the seasons. Oh no. For the truly fashionable, there were holiday pots. Some households kept special pots for Easter guests, delicately painted with eggs and hares. One aristocratic family had a set of Christmas chamber pots, complete with garlands and golden bells painted along the rim. The lid, in that particular case, was shaped like a wrapped gift. That's commitment. And of course, guest-specific pots were a thing. You'd never subject your visitors to a pot that didn't match the room or feel suitably festive. That would be vulgar. So, just as guest bedrooms had their own tailored themes, their chamber pots were chosen to blend in perfectly. Now here's your fringe tidbit for this dreamy descent. In a certain duke's estate, there existed a pot room, an actual room dedicated solely to the storage and display of their vast collection of seasonal and occasion-specific chamber pots. Rows and rows of porcelain, each labeled, organized by season, and lovingly dusted by a footman whose job, quite literally, was to manage the family's toilet rotation. He was called, affectionately, the custodian of the commode. There's a scholarly debate around whether this was common or just extreme eccentricity. Some argue that only the ultra-wealthy could indulge in such elaborate pot-keeping. Others believe that while the Duke's collection was exceptional, rotating chamber pots was not so rare among well-to-do families, especially in households where entertaining guests was a weekly ritual. It's not hard to understand why. Imagine being Lady Somerville, hosting an intimate luncheon for the Duchess of Kent. She's staying the weekend. You've prepared the finest china, the best linens, a floral arrangement that screams, "I'm naturally elegant and definitely not trying too hard." But then, disaster. Your lady's maid forgets to swap out the autumn-themed chamber pot, and now your guest is confronted with pumpkins and chestnuts in the month of May. You may as well have served soup with a salad fork. The pressure for perfect presentation was so intense that some decorators made careers just designing seasonal interior schemes, which included chamber pots. Pattern books from the period show designs with accompanying toiletware suggestions. One such suggestion: for rooms of a cooler blue tone, a pot of winter glaze with argent filigree is recommended. Argent filigree on a bedpan. And just when you think it can't possibly get more niche, we find evidence of event-specific pots. Pots made for weddings. Pots for anniversaries. There's even record of a pot gifted to a couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, painted entirely in gold with the message, "Through all life seasons." Honestly, that's kind of beautiful. And kind of horrifying. But beyond the decorative joy of it all, there was a deeper motivation at play: control. These rotating, themed pots were not just for fun. They were part of the Victorian war on chaos. If you could coordinate your home by season, if everything had a place and everything followed the calendar, then perhaps, just perhaps, you could hold back the tide of mortality, unpredictability, and mess. Even if only for a moment. Even if only with porcelain. Victorians, you see, were obsessed with structure. The idea that life had a proper order, and that every stage, every season, every necessity had its matching place. From birth to death, from breakfast to bedtime, life was mapped out in a symphony of schedules and rituals. And the chamber pot, ever loyal, ever hidden, marched right along with the seasons. Now here's your laugh for the evening. One particularly theatrical household reportedly had a birthday pot that was rolled out once a year for the patriarch. It was covered in hand-painted cakes and lit candles. And inside, on the bottom, it said, "Make a wish." I'll let you decide how that played out in real life. Some collectors today have managed to piece together surviving sets of these themed pots, and they are as strange and lovely as you'd imagine. A spring pot with pastel daisies. A winter one with icy blue snowflakes. A summer piece with ladybugs on the lid. Each a little porcelain window into a world where people found comfort in rituals, in beauty, and yes, in having the perfect potty for the season. And let's not ignore the modern echoes of this behavior. We still rotate things with the seasons. Our wardrobes. Our decorations. Our scents. Scented candles for fall. Linen sprays for summer. Some of us even change bathroom towels and rugs to suit the time of year. So before you roll your eyes at the idea of a festive Easter chamber pot, ask yourself if you've ever swapped out your soap dish for a holiday version. If you have, congratulations. You're halfway to being a Victorian toilet curator. So as your eyelids grow heavy and the room around you drifts into quiet, let this thought nestle in. There once existed entire households where the changing of the leaves didn't just mean sweaters and cider, it meant time to change the pot. Because to the Victorians, every detail mattered. Every room told a story. And even in the most private, least glamorous moments, they insisted on a little poetry, a little elegance, and a little seasonal flair. You're getting comfortable now, drifting deeper into this oddly soothing tale of chamber pot pageantry. But don't close your eyes just yet. We're heading straight into the heart of one of the strangest rivalries of the Victorian age. Because behind every gilded rim, beneath every seasonal lily motif, and beneath the lid of every porcelain pot, there was competition. Welcome to the world of pottery rivalries and maker's marks, where chamber pots weren't just household items. They were battlefield trophies in the war for ceramic dominance. If you thought your toaster brand mattered, imagine a time when even your toiletware had to carry the right label. In the 19th century, much like today's race for luxury brands in fashion or cars, owning a chamber pot stamped with the logo of a prestigious manufacturer was a low-key flex of status, taste, and wealth. And like any thriving industry, the porcelain business had its stars, its secrets, and its scandals. Let's start with a bit of historical fact. The hub of this entire operation was the Staffordshire Potteries in England. Stoke-on-Trent, nicknamed the Potteries, was home to some of the most famous ceramic producers in Victorian history. Wedgwood, Minton, Spode, and Royal Doulton, just to name a few. These weren't fly-by-night operations. These were serious businesses producing everything from fine china and figurines to decorative tiles and, yes, luxury chamber pots. Now, to the average passerby, one chamber pot might look much like another. But to the trained eye, especially the Victorian housewife or an eagle-eyed maid, it was all in the maker's mark. Usually found on the bottom of the pot, these stamps or insignias told you exactly where the pot was made, which factory it came from, and sometimes even which artisan worked on it. It was the equivalent of turning over your friend's dinner plate and discovering it was Hermes. And yes, people checked. One mainstream fact: by 1850, it had become common practice for ceramics manufacturers to mark their products with an official logo or stamp. These marks became essential for identifying the origin of pieces, especially in upper-class households where brand loyalty and bragging rights were practically currency. So of course, rivalries bloomed. Minton, for example, was known for its ultra-refined, hand-painted pieces with distinctive turquoise glazes. Their chamber pots were practically museum-worthy. Wedgwood focused on neoclassical elegance, with clean lines and pale blue motifs. Spode leaned into floral design and was especially popular with the middle to upper classes. Royal Doulton eventually cornered the market with mass appeal, but in the early years, they too produced personalized, high-end toiletware for aristocrats. Imagine the drawing room gossip. "Oh dear, did you see Lady Chelmsford's pot? I believe it's only Spode." A bit pedestrian, don't you think? Fringe tidbit time. There's a known example of a ceramic forger who made a career by faking makers' marks on cheaper pots and selling them to newly wealthy Victorians trying to keep up appearances. His specialty was copying the Wedgwood seal. The scam worked, until a pot cracked during a guest stay, revealing a rather crude interior glaze, and an observant duchess reportedly declared, "I believe the lady's porcelain is putting on airs." These marks mattered, not just because they confirmed quality, but because they hinted at belonging. Owning Minton or Wedgwood wasn't just a financial choice, it was a cultural one. It suggested education, refinement, maybe even a connection to the royal household. After all, Queen Victoria herself was known to favor certain potteries. If your lavatory accessories came from the same factory as the Queen's tea set, well, that meant something. Here's where the rivalry got interesting. Pottery companies began designing signature chamber pot styles that clients could recognize. Minton pots often had exaggerated curved handles and slightly flared rims, easy to lift, graceful to carry, if such a thing is possible. Wedgwood preferred oval-shaped bases and neoclassical reliefs. Doulton played with textures and introduced limited editions. Owning one was a bit like having an early iPhone. Same function, different prestige. This is where things start to feel familiar. Much like today's obsession with sneaker drops or rare handbags, Victorians began collecting, and yes, comparing, their potteries. Entire households were known to use different brands in different rooms, each carefully selected to match that room's theme. Some families were fiercely loyal to one brand across every object in their house. Others mixed and matched, the way you might own a Louis Vuitton bag but wear Adidas shoes. There's even evidence that gift-giving between families often involved brand-specific pots. A house guest might receive a Doulton pot as a wedding gift or a Wedgwood piece as a token of friendship. These weren't gag gifts. They were serious symbols of respect, status, and domestic taste. A scholarly debate still simmers on whether this rivalry helped elevate the chamber pot into a legitimate art form. Some argue that competition among potters forced them to push the artistic envelope, leading to pots with finer glazes, better ergonomics, yes, really, and stunning visuals. Others believe the rivalry caused unnecessary extravagance, encouraging wasteful spending on what was, fundamentally, a toilet. Both camps have a point. One museum curator once remarked that chamber pots are the perfect Victorian artifact. Beautiful, useful, ridiculous. And they were. Some limited edition pieces were commissioned with not only unique designs, but accompanying toilet journals, small books recording the origins of the pot, who designed it, and for what purpose. One such entry reads, "For Lady Henley's Winter Suite, 1887, with gratitude from the Wedgwood Company." A thank you note. For a toilet commission. You can imagine the ripple effects this had on the working classes. As middle-class Victorians climbed the social ladder, they, too, wanted their homes filled with prestige. So naturally, they bought into the rivalry, maybe not the hand-painted or custom-glazed versions, but definitely the mass-market designs inspired by them. Doulton, always quick to spot a trend, launched several economy lines of toiletware mimicking the fancier pots, stamped with simplified marks. That's right, Victorian knockoffs were a thing. Here's your joke for the section. One pamphlet for a mass-market chamber pot boasted, styled in the manner of Minton, without the Minton price. Today, we call that inspired by. Back then, it was just cheeky business. Of course, the rivalry didn't end with the pot itself. Storage cabinets, pot lids, and even the little cushions used to soften the sound of a ceramic pot being placed on a wooden floor. Yes, cushions were also branded and sold in matched sets. If you were loyal to Wedgwood, by heavens, your pot cushion had better be Wedgwood blue with the appropriate crest. All of this speaks to the deeper truth of the Victorian era, the relentless performance of taste. Every item in the home, from the chandelier to the chamber pot, was part of a delicate balancing act between function and flair. You didn't just own things. You curated them. You didn't just buy a pot. You bought a piece of a larger narrative, one where your household, your family, and your behind were all part of an aesthetic story. So as you lie there now, cocooned in warmth, think about the quiet war that raged beneath the beds and inside the cupboards of Victorian mansions. A war fought not with swords, but with brushes and glazes and little ceramic stamps. Each pot a soldier in the battle for refinement. And all that, just for something to pee in. As your mind drifts deeper into this porcelain-coated dreamscape, we now tiptoe into perhaps the most bizarre and surprisingly clever corners of the Victorian bedpan world. The hidden features, trick mechanisms, and secret compartments that made some chamber pots as much a feat of engineering as of artistry. Yes, tonight, we're unlocking lids, lifting panels, and peeking beneath what at first glance appeared to be just another flowery pot. Because some of these dainty little treasures had surprises inside. Welcome to the world of secret compartments and cleverly disguised bedpans. If you thought a chamber pot was just a bowl with a handle, you're in for a delightful shock. The truth is, wealthy Victorians, who had both money and imagination, demanded that even their most private possessions be innovative. And pot makers, ever eager to please, stepped up with designs that were not only functional and beautiful, but also secretly extra. Let's begin with a historical fact. By the mid-19th century, patents for sanitary ware innovations began flooding into Britain's patent office, including multiple designs for improved chamber pots. These ranged from clever sealing mechanisms to odor-reducing features and, yes, even disguised models that looked nothing like chamber pots at all. Some of these innovations were genuinely practical. For instance, certain high-end pots had tight-fitting lids with cork or rubber seals, designed to trap odors, especially important in upstairs bedrooms where pots might sit overnight before being emptied by servants in the morning. Others came with hinged covers, spring-loaded clasps, or padded tops that muffled sound when the lid was closed. And then, there were the perfume chambers. Yes, you heard that right. Some luxurious chamber pots came equipped with built-in scent compartments. Tiny hollow sections near the lid or under the handle, designed to hold lavender, rose petals, or perfumed wax tablets. As the pot was used and warmed, the scent would gently release into the air, masking the less floral notes. It was the Victorian version of a bathroom diffuser, except attached to a pot. Here's a fringe tidbit that'll stay with you long after tonight. One recovered pot, now sitting in a museum archive, has a tiny brass compartment hidden beneath its base. Inside was a dried-out sponge infused with patchouli oil, still faintly aromatic after more than 100 years. Let that sink in. A secret smelling sponge. On a pot. But wait, things get stranger. The truly extravagant chamber pots weren't just decorative, they were multifunctional. One particularly notable design was the transforming pot. At first glance, it appeared to be a modest footstool, with velvet upholstery and carved wooden legs. But when pressed in just the right spot, click, a hinge released, the cushion lifted, and underneath was a gleaming porcelain pot, complete with lid, chamber, and built-in candle holder. That's right. Some pots came with built-in lighting. The idea was simple. If you were using the chamber pot in the dead of night, you didn't want to risk knocking over a candle or fumbling with matches. So, some inventors included a small, enclosed glass chamber for a candle, or later, a gas lamp, within the pot's frame. You lit it once, and the glow would help guide your nighttime visit without waking anyone else. Admittedly, putting a flame next to a flammable object under a bed sounds like a recipe for disaster. But hey, aesthetics before safety, as the Victorians might have whispered. There was also the travel pot phenomenon. For aristocrats on the move, whether visiting the countryside, staying with friends, or heading off on grand tours across Europe, portability became essential. Enter the collapsible chamber pot. These genius inventions had folding legs, hinged rims, and telescoping bowls. Yes, like a Victorian version of those camping cups that expand with a twist. Some were stored in leather cases, complete with small compartments for wipes, usually cloth, a small vial of scent, and occasionally, a monogrammed towel. It was everything you needed to freshen up in one discreet travel box. Let's not forget, many rich Victorians didn't trust public facilities, and rightly so. Sanitation was hit or miss, usually miss, so bringing your own pot was considered smart, hygienic, and, most importantly, fashionable. It was like bringing your own personal bidet, except it folded into a mahogany case. One elite travel pot, preserved today, even has a built-in music box. The theory was that a soft melody, probably something like Greensleeves, would provide a bit of auditory distraction during the more awkward moments. I'll leave it to your imagination whether that helped or made things significantly worse. Here's your laugh for the section. There's an account of a guest who accidentally set off the music box while trying to open the lid, causing a burst of melody in the dead of night and waking up an entire floor of a manor house. The pot was promptly retired, and its owner allegedly quipped, "It's bad enough being caught with one's trousers down. I don't need an orchestra announcing it." Now, for some scholarly debate. Historians differ on whether these innovations were driven by function or fantasy. Some argue that these advanced pots were practical solutions for real problems: odors, privacy, portability. Others suggest it was all about gadget fever, a kind of toilet-themed tech arms race where wealthy Victorians indulged their love of complexity in the most unexpected ways. Think about it. This was the era of wind-up clocks, hidden compartments in desks, pop-up bookcases, even tables that could transform into beds. The mechanized chamber pot was just another chapter in the story of a culture obsessed with tinkering, innovating, and never being caught without options, even when nature called. A few inventions even bordered on absurd. One patent filed in 1873 describes a chamber pot that could be flushed manually using a reservoir of perfumed water stored in a hidden tank above. The mechanism required a pull cord, a small copper pump, and gravity. It was, in effect, a mini toilet, but portable. The cost of this device? Nearly a year's wages for a household maid. Did it work well? Absolutely not. But the idea of it was intoxicatingly modern. Of course, these innovations weren't always discreet. In some households, showing off your latest pot design became a bizarre form of elite bonding. It wasn't uncommon for guests of a certain status to compare notes, quietly, in private, on their newest installments. There were murmurs in tea rooms. "Oh yes, ours sings when you lift the lid. We've just had one fitted with mother-of-pearl pedals. like an organ. The Victorians were weird, but delightfully so. Let's not forget one final detail: security. In certain cases, chamber pots were stored in lockable cabinets. That's right, locks. Usually to keep out pets or children, but sometimes to maintain privacy or protect rare, valuable designs. If you had a one-of-a-kind French import, you didn't just leave it lying around. You locked it up like fine silver. So, as you lie there now, maybe your eyes growing heavier, think of this. Beneath the prim exterior of those stiff-collared Victorians beat the hearts of inventors, dreamers, people who looked at a pot and said, "Sure, this is fine, but what if it had drawers? What if it played music? What if it folded into a hat box?" It's funny, really. For a society so famously repressed, the Victorians managed to let their imaginations run absolutely wild, in the most unlikely of places. You're sinking deeper now, letting this peculiar porcelain parade lull you into a cozy haze. But don't drift off just yet. We've arrived at one of the most bizarre yet entirely predictable truths of upper-class Victorian society. Even their toilets were social statements. That's right. In a world where manners were measured in teaspoons and reputations were built on the softness of one's guest towels, the humble chamber pot became a secret weapon in the quiet war of social flexing. Tonight, we're exploring how rich Victorians used their bathroom habits to brag, boast, and battle for status, one pot at a time. It might sound absurd, but let's put it in context. This was a culture where your front parlor was styled to reflect your reading habits, your stair runner was judged for its stitch count, and your breakfast china was expected to subtly scream, "I belong in Debrett's peerage." So why on earth would your chamber pot be allowed to sit silently in the background, plain, unbranded, and out of sync with the rest of your glittering domestic self-promotion? No. In Victorian society, everything was a performance. And in the most exclusive circles, toiletware became a kind of secret handshake, a whispered flex that only the in crowd would ever recognize. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. In the 19th century, the British upper classes relied heavily on unspoken visual cues to express wealth, education, refinement, and social belonging. Open displays of money were considered vulgar, but coded displays, embroidered linens, monogrammed spoons, commissioned oil portraits, were the norm. And since chamber pots were technically household furnishings, they weren't exempt. In fact, it became something of a game. You wouldn't talk about your chamber pot, heavens no, but you might allow it to be glimpsed. Just glimpsed. Perhaps while your guest was being shown to their room by a maid who accidentally left the cabinet ajar. Maybe there was a sliver of gold trim just visible under the bed. Or perhaps the lid was left ever so slightly askew, revealing a delicate peacock feather motif. Just enough for your guest to see and think, "Ah, taste." It wasn't just about luxury, it was about belonging to a certain aesthetic world. Having the right pot, from the right maker, with the right design, positioned in the right way, sent a message. It said, "We are those people. The tasteful ones. The ones who know that even our chamber pots must match the season and bear the family crest." Fringe tidbit time. A letter from 1879 written by a young woman visiting a stately home in Wiltshire describes her embarrassment at having been given a guest room with a plainly glazed pot in the corner, bearing no mark nor paint. She wrote to her mother, "I fear we are not truly in the highest favor here." Yes, her ranking in the social hierarchy was determined, in part, by the design of the pot she was expected to use. Now, here's where things get absolutely bonkers. Some elite hosts actually maintained tiered chamber pot collections, assigning specific pots to guests of different social rank. The more important the guest, the finer the pot. A duke might receive the full gilt-edged floral porcelain masterpiece, complete with quilted velvet lid and monogram. A baron might get blue and white transfer wear. A cousin's awkward suitor from Liverpool, pewter, no frills, and maybe a chipped edge for good measure. Let's not ignore the servant's role in this drama. Maids, butlers, and housekeepers were often responsible for positioning the pot just so. Neither too hidden nor too overt. They understood the politics of the pot, and some became unofficial advisors on such matters. Lady Thistlethwaite prefers her rose and lily design during Lent, one might whisper to another, or don't place the daffodil-lidded one in the east guest room, Lord Rotham is allergic. Because if you're going to silently judge people based on their floral patterns, you'd better get it right. Now for a scholarly debate. Some historians argue that this pot as social signal phenomenon is overstated, that it was really just about cleanliness and convenience. Others vehemently disagree, pointing to household inventories, personal letters, and preserved etiquette manuals that treat bedroom accessories, including chamber pots, with the same meticulous classification as one might assign to silverware or bed linens. After all, everything in the Victorian home carried symbolic weight. A library with dusty books? You weren't a serious reader. A dining room without matching cutlery? You lacked polish. A chamber pot that wasn't up to par? Well, if you don't respect yourself enough to urinate over mother of pearl, how can you be trusted with land? Here's your laugh for the section. One particularly pretentious host was known to introduce his guests to their chamber pots. Not personally, of course. He had a butler for that. Upon being shown to their room, guests were discreetly informed, should you require it, your nighttime vessel is a Royal Worcester, painted by Miss Florence Bishop herself. Do enjoy. Because nothing prepares you for a restful night's sleep like knowing your pot was painted by a society artist. But it wasn't always about the artistry. Sometimes it was the scarcity of the design that impressed. Much like people today flaunt limited edition sneakers or rare watches, Victorians prized pots made in limited series, special commissions or short-run designs from famous potters. One woman reportedly traveled with a chamber pot that had been made exclusively for her great-grandmother. It bore a gold S on the lid, surrounded by painted ivy, and was only brought out for significant company. Imagine being introduced to a family heirloom, and then being expected to use it. And as strange as it sounds, people noticed. If a guest returned from a weekend at a grand estate and gushed about the marbled wallpaper, the Duckerel orange, and the chamber pot with the dancing cherubs, you knew your host had achieved peak Victorian domestic glory. In a world where gossip was currency, your pot could, quietly, make or break you. Let's not forget the merchants who fanned these flames. Pottery manufacturers, well aware of their ware's social significance, began marketing their pots with carefully worded elegance. For the discerning home, read one advert. Another promised, so refined in shape and ornament, it need not be hidden away. That's right, they were selling chamber pots designed to be seen. Not prominently, of course, but perhaps glimpsed by the right eyes. One popular innovation was the decorative stand, a small wooden or iron frame with curved legs and delicate scrollwork, designed to hold the chamber pot in such a way that it blended with the room's overall theme. Some had built-in candle holders. Others were upholstered to match the bed's footboard. It was like hiding your stereo speakers in your bookshelf, except the speaker was a pot. And yet, for all the extravagance, one truth remained. These chamber pots were still used for, well, you know. That was the irony at the heart of the whole performance. For all the gold rims and imported perfume compartments, at the end of the day, it was still a chamber pot. A place to go when it was dark, when the fire had burned low, and when no one was watching. Or at least, not visibly watching. So as you lie there now, tucked into your own sheets, think about those grand old houses, their marble foyers and lace curtains, and the quiet little ceramic masterpieces hiding beneath brocade skirts. Think about how, in a world obsessed with appearances, even the things meant to be hidden became tools for showing off. Because to a Victorian aristocrat, everything was part of the performance. Even the pot under the bed had a role to play. And if it happened to be hand-painted by a famous artist, monogrammed in gold, and scented with lavender, well then, You are clearly someone of true refinement. You're floating now, halfway between waking and sleep, but the story isn't done just yet. The chamber pot, our humble, porcelain protagonist, still has one more trick to reveal: its sense of humor. Because not every pot under a four-poster bed in Victorian England was serious, gilded, and desperate to be taken as an artistic masterpiece. No, some were funny. Some were downright naughty. And tonight, we're pulling back the quilt to explore the winking, whispering world of satirical pots and cheeky designs. The ones that dared to poke fun at propriety from beneath the lace-trimmed shadows of Victorian respectability. Let's start with a simple truth. Victorians were not all prudes. Yes, they built their public lives on rigid etiquette, social codes, and long-winded euphemisms. But behind closed doors, many of them had a wicked sense of humor. And where better to express that hidden mischief than on something meant to be hidden? One mainstream historical fact: satire was everywhere in Victorian culture. Political cartoons filled the newspapers. Satirical novels and stage plays were wildly popular. Even household objects weren't spared. From tea towels with embroidered puns to greeting cards with double meanings, the middle and upper classes found ways to let off steam with a wink and a grin. So of course, some of that spirit leaked into their chamber pots. Enter the caricature pot. These pots featured painted faces, often of politicians, nobles, or unpopular figures, inside the bowl itself. That's right. You'd lift the lid, look inside, and find a grinning or scowling face waiting for you. One particularly popular design from the 1860s featured a grotesquely exaggerated portrait of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, complete with monocle and startled expression. No inscription, no context, just Disraeli, looking up, forever. These were known in polite circles as face pots. In less polite circles, well, let's just say the Victorians weren't above using more colourful language. There's a fringe tidbit for you. Some of these satirical pots were sold at public fairs, alongside novelty items and trick gadgets. You could buy a pot with Queen Victoria's face, although rumour has it you'd best keep that one out of sight if you didn't want a visit from the local constable. Others featured local lords, unpopular clergymen, or fictional characters from comic operas. The idea was always the same: laugh privately, but laugh nonetheless. And laugh they did. These pots became popular as gag gifts among certain circles, particularly among bachelors, artists, and eccentric collectors. They were perfect for bachelor apartments, artist studios, or even gifted among friends who had the sort of sense of humor that required no explanation. Some even featured rude phrases written around the rim. Now, we're staying firmly PG-13 here, but let's just say many of these phrases involved thinly veiled references to bodily functions, marriage, or aging. One pot bore the inscription, "A throne for your highness." Another, more daring, said simply, "Make haste, my lord." Here's your laugh for the section. One upper-crust prankster commissioned a chamber pot with a mirror fixed to the bottom. When his guests lifted the lid, surprise, they were greeted not with painted roses or poetry, but with their own slightly warped reflection. It was said he used to chuckle behind the door whenever someone took a midnight visit, waiting for the startled gasp. A touch creepy, perhaps, but also very, very Victorian. Now for a scholarly debate. Some experts believe these pots were part of a wider, quietly subversive trend, a way for people to play with taboo, to poke fun at social structures without technically breaking any rules. By hiding these jokes in the most private places, Victorians could indulge in their irreverence without fear of scandal. It was satire in porcelain form, secret, disposable, and literally flushed away. Others argue it was simply novelty. No deeper meaning, no rebellion, just good old-fashioned bathroom humor. After all, humans are humans. Even if you're wearing a cravat and sipping Darjeeling in the drawing room, you're still going to giggle at a cleverly placed pun or a caricature with wild eyebrows. But what makes these pots truly fascinating is their double life. On the outside, they looked just like any other pot. Same ceramic glaze, same floral trim, same refined shape. But inside, tucked beneath the lid, was a private joke, shared only with those bold enough to lift it. It's the ultimate Victorian contradiction. Outwardly prim, inwardly giggling. And let's not forget the mass-produced versions that followed. As these humorous pots gained popularity, manufacturers began creating whole lines of satirical toiletware. Some included nursery rhymes with altered endings, some included portraits of known social climbers with exaggerated noses and jowls, and a few were even interactive. You'd pour in water, and as it swirled, it would slowly reveal a hidden picture or phrase. There's a preserved example in a small museum in Yorkshire that features a bucolic farm scene. Sheep, a barn, a country lane. But after the pot was used and flushed, or rinsed, a second layer of paint would reveal a cheeky message in the clouds, "You old goat." But not all jokes were purely light-hearted. Some satirical pots were sharp, political weapons, expressing discontent with certain figures or institutions. These were sometimes circulated in quiet circles among reform-minded groups, artists, or radicals. One early feminist reportedly gifted her close friends with pots bearing portraits of notoriously anti-suffrage politicians, encouraging them to put the men where they belonged. Scandalous? Certainly. Cathartic? Absolutely. Let's talk design now. Unlike the refined patterns we've discussed, those coordinated with wallpapers or bearing delicate scrollwork, satirical pots were often deliberately exaggerated. Colors were bolder. Designs were cartoonish. Lids were oversized or oddly shaped. They wanted to be noticed, even if they still pretended otherwise. And some were interactive in the most literal sense. One rare design featured a whistling lid, a small built-in whistle that would let out a soft toot when lifted too quickly. Invented by a ceramicist with a rather juvenile sense of humor, it was briefly popular among young aristocrats before being banned in several boarding schools for causing excessive disturbance during the night. Because nothing says Victorian discipline like expelling a student over a novelty toilet. Now here's the strange part. Some of these joke pots survived better than their serious counterparts. Why? Because they were remembered. People passed them down, kept them in attics, showed them off at parties once they were no longer in daily use. Today, they fetch high prices at antique auctions, not just for their rarity, but because they give us a glimpse of a Victorian world that was more playful, more human, and far less uptight than we sometimes assume. They remind us that underneath the corsets and calling cards, people still wanted to laugh. So as your room grows darker and your breath slows, picture one last scene, a grand country house, silent after a long dinner party. Upstairs, a guest excuses himself and tiptoes to the corner of the room. He opens a velvet cabinet, lifts the lid of a porcelain pot, and bursts into muffled laughter. Inside, a perfectly painted image of a bumbling politician stares back at him, complete with wiggling eyebrows and a speech bubble that says, "Flush me at your leisure." That, dear listener, was the Victorian sense of humor. Private, sophisticated, and just a little bit unhinged. The fire's nearly out, your eyes are growing heavier, and yet the story gently continues. Because some chamber pots, those once humble household companions, have lived long and surprisingly eventful afterlives. In this section, we take a curious step into the modern world, where these decorated Victorian relics no longer sit beneath four-poster beds, but rather under spotlights in auction houses and museum glass cases. Tonight, you'll learn how what was once private, porcelain, and perhaps even perfumed, has become collectible, celebrated, and, in some cases, worth more than a new car. Yes, it's true, in the 21st century, some Victorian chamber pots are now selling for thousands. Not because of their function, obviously, but because of their history, their craftsmanship, and, quite often, their sheer absurdity. The more ornate, rare, or humorous the pot, the higher the bidding. What once caught the attention of guests through an accidental reveal under the bed is now catching the eye of wealthy collectors with a fondness for eccentric antiques. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. Victorian porcelain is widely collected, from tea sets and tiles to figurines and, yes, chamber pots. The late 19th century was a golden age of ceramic manufacturing in Britain, and items from famous potteries like Minton, Wedgwood, and Royal Worcester are now prized not just for their beauty, but for their historical significance. But while tea sets might fetch a polite nod of appreciation, chamber pots bring something else to the table: shock, amusement, and curiosity. You're not just buying a pot, you're buying a conversation piece, a slice of absurd, intimate history. And for collectors of the obscure and eccentric, there's nothing quite like owning a museum-quality example of what people used to, well, sit on. Auction houses have caught on. Sotheby's has auctioned at least one gilded chamber pot that fetched nearly £4,000. Bonham's listed a hand-painted, rose-adorned Royal Doulton pot with a gold-plated rim and custom family crest, appraised at over £2,500. The auction notes called it a masterful balance of refinement and utility, which is possibly the most polite way to describe a toilet ever printed. Fringe tidbit time. In 2011, an anonymous collector paid over $6,000 for a marriage pot, a rare piece presented to a Victorian couple on their wedding day. It was decorated with intertwined initials, painted white doves, and the ominous inscription, "Together forever, in all things." Interpret that however you will. But it's not just auctions. Museums have also embraced the bedpan boom. While not always displayed front and center, many decorative chamber pots are quietly included in exhibitions on domestic life, medical history, or Victorian design. Institutions like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Museum of the Home feature examples in their collections, often hidden in period rooms, peeking from beneath antique dressers, waiting for eagle-eyed visitors to spot them. What's fascinating is the way these items are framed, not as jokes, but as reflections of social norms, gender roles, class identity, and technological transition. One curator described a chamber pot in her collection as a symbol of beauty applied to the unspeakable, a very Victorian idea. That, in itself, says everything. There's a scholarly debate about how these artifacts should be interpreted. Some argue they belong strictly in the realm of design history, celebrated for their craftsmanship, hand painting, and glazing techniques. Others see them as social documents, every bit as revealing as a letter or a diary. After all, how people handled their most private needs tells us just as much, if not more, about their values and anxieties as how they dressed or dined. And then there's a third camp, those who see these pots as objects of humor, the perfect blend of antique beauty and bathroom joke. It's why they've become popular among certain collectors, especially those who enjoy hosting. Nothing says eccentric host quite like pointing to a delicately displayed porcelain pot and saying, "That one was used by an earl." Probably. Here's your laugh for the section. In 2016, a bed and breakfast in Sussex began displaying a collection of chamber pots in their guest rooms, each one paired with a small card explaining its history, design origin, and estimated value. Guests reportedly loved it. One American tourist wrote in a review, "I've never learned so much about Victorian bathroom habits while brushing my teeth." That's education, ambience, and awkward timing all rolled into one. Of course, not all museum-quality pots were owned by the elite. Some of the most interesting specimens come from middle-class homes, where decoration often mixed aspiration with utility. These pots may not bear gold rims, but they often feature transfer-printed designs, pastoral scenes, floral borders, or humorous inscriptions. Some include makers' marks identifying small regional potteries that are now extinct, tiny, forgotten businesses that once tried to make chamber pots as elegant as teacups. And it's not just British museums. Across Europe, in parts of Germany, France, and the Netherlands, institutions with a focus on hygiene history have also included chamber pots in their exhibits. Some go even further, showcasing the evolution from pot to flush toilet, highlighting how design priorities shifted as plumbing improved. Let's not forget the restoration market, either. A growing number of artisans specialize in restoring and preserving antique chamber pots. Cracked rims are repaired with invisible adhesives, faded paint is carefully retouched, and missing lids are recreated using 3D printing and historical pattern books. These artisans understand that they're not just preserving ceramics, they're preserving a window into the intimate side of Victorian life. It's also worth noting how Victorian toiletware has influenced modern design. You can still find boutique home goods companies today producing vintage-inspired bathroom accessories, many of which borrow floral motifs, rounded shapes, and color palettes straight from 19th century chamber pots. Ironically, while most of us now use sleek porcelain thrones bolted to plumbing, there's been a design movement bringing back the look of the old world. Just without the actual bucket. And yes, some people still buy antique chamber pots to use, not for their original purpose, of course, but as flower vases, ice buckets, and even cookie jars. One homeowner reportedly keeps a hand-painted Wedgwood pot in her hallway, filled with fresh tulips. Visitors never suspect a thing, until they ask where she got the unique little bowl. There's something oddly satisfying about that transformation, from vessel of necessity to vessel of beauty. It's poetic, in a way. These pots, once hidden under beds and emptied by candlelight, are now admired under bright museum lights, talked about in hushed reverence, and polished with as much care as a royal tea set. So as you lie there tonight, eyes closed, think about that, the long life of a pot. Born in a pottery factory in Stoke-on-Trent, glazed and painted with love, sent off to a manor house in Kent, used discreetly by a countess in the dead of night, and then, over a century later, rediscovered in an attic, dusted off, auctioned to a collector in New York, and finally placed behind glass, labeled as a work of domestic art. What an unexpected journey! And isn't that the charm of it all? The fact that even something so mundane, so quietly tucked away, can find a second life as a treasured artifact? It's a reminder that history is everywhere, even in the most private corners, even under the bed. As your thoughts drift like steam rising from an early morning teacup, we turn now to the slow fading of our strange ceramic star. Because nothing lasts forever, not even hand-painted porcelain bedpans with embossed gold rims and hidden perfume compartments. In this chapter of the story, we explore the twilight of the chamber pot, the graceful and sometimes unceremonious exit of decorative toiletware as modern plumbing stepped onto the stage. Welcome to the age of transition, where pots gave way to pipes, and the death of the pretty pot was mourned only by those who truly understood its peculiar charm. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. The second half of the 19th century witnessed a rapid expansion of urban infrastructure, especially in Britain. Indoor plumbing, flush toilets, and sewage systems began spreading through cities and into wealthier rural estates. At first, these luxuries were confined to the very rich. But by the 1880s and 1890s, they were becoming increasingly accessible to the growing middle class. And as the toilet tank rose in popularity, the chamber pot began its slow retreat into obscurity. And what a bittersweet decline it was. Imagine the moment, a grand Victorian estate with tapestries, crystal chandeliers, and a dedicated staff of 20. In the corner of the master suite, beneath an embroidered velvet curtain, sits a porcelain chamber pot, unused for months, perhaps years. The mistress of the house now prefers the gleaming white flush toilet newly installed behind a polished oak door. It hisses when you pull the chain, swirls like a magician's trick, and takes everything away without effort. The pot, meanwhile, sits quietly, dignified, decorated, forgotten. Many pots were simply boxed up and stored, too valuable or sentimental to throw away, too obsolete to continue using. Others were repurposed. Some became planters, others dog bowls, and a few were transformed into ashtrays or storage jars. More than one family is believed to have kept a favorite pot on the hearth, filled with kindling or matches, a kind of cheeky reminder of a bygone era. But let's be honest, many were discarded, tossed out, broken up, or buried behind garden sheds, especially when modern tastes began to lean toward the sleek, sterile, and minimalist. In a world of flushing toilets, ceramic artistry lost its place in the most private room of the house. Here's a fringe tidbit for your drifting thoughts. In 1904, an etiquette manual advised housewives to remove all toilet receptacles from visible quarters upon the introduction of modern conveniences. The implication? Chamber pots were now embarrassing relics, to be tucked away like skeletons in the domestic closet. Overnight, objects once seen as necessary, even elegant, became awkward reminders of a less advanced time. And that awkwardness only grew. Children who'd grown up watching their parents empty chamber pots now used flushing toilets as standard. By the early 20th century, a generational divide had opened, and with it, a kind of collective amnesia. People didn't want to remember the pot. They wanted to forget. It wasn't beautiful anymore. It was backward. But not everyone let go so easily. Here's where the scholarly debate begins. Some historians argue that the death of the chamber pot wasn't just about technology. It was about class and identity. To embrace indoor plumbing was to step into modernity, progress, and cleanliness. Holding onto a chamber pot, even a decorative one, suggested a reluctance to move on, or worse, a lack of refinement. As a result, many households didn't just stop using pots, they actively purged them, treating them like outdated relics of a more primitive age. Others push back on this idea. They argue that for many people, especially those in rural or working class areas, chamber pots remained essential tools well into the 20th century. Indoor plumbing may have taken over cities, but it spread unevenly. And even in homes with modern bathrooms, the chamber pot sometimes remained as a backup, a sentimental keepsake, or even a symbol of tradition. There's a quiet tragedy in all of this. The very objects that once served so intimately, with such care and attention to detail, were now discarded like common trash. Imagine the pot that had been custom ordered from France, painted with violets and gilded by hand, now lying at the bottom of a rubbish heap. Or worse, shattered in pieces beneath a pile of old bricks, its once proud crest split in half by time. And yet, some survived. Some were kept in attics by nostalgic grandmothers. Others were tucked into curio cabinets by eccentric uncles. A few found their way into antique shops, where their strange mix of elegance and vulgarity attracted the curious. One by one, they began to re-emerge, not as functional tools, but as artifacts, conversation pieces, museum relics. And slowly, the shame melted away. People began to appreciate the craftsmanship, the history, the humor. The chamber pot was no longer just a symbol of outdated sanitation. It became a window into a different way of living. A reminder that even the most routine aspects of life could be imbued with beauty, dignity, and care. Here's your laugh for the evening. In the 1930s, a forward-thinking designer attempted to reintroduce the decorative chamber pot as a luxury bedside accessory for the modern woman. It had a mirrored lid, a tiny drawer for toiletries, and was advertised in high-end magazines as the ideal midnight companion. Needless to say, the idea didn't catch on, but full points for effort. Some designers today still nod to these relics in their work. High-end bathroom accessories, soap dishes, tissue boxes, toothbrush holders, now borrow the rounded shapes and floral motifs of Victorian chamber pots. In a way, the pot has been resurrected, not in form, but in spirit. Its essence lingers in the background of our modern cleanliness, whispering stories from beneath the bed. So how do we say goodbye to the chamber pot? We don't, really. It's still here, hiding in plain sight. In the pattern of a vintage sink. In the glaze of a floral-tiled bathroom wall. In the quiet satisfaction of a well-designed object that serves its purpose with grace. The chamber pot may have faded from use, but it hasn't faded from memory. Not entirely. And perhaps that's fitting. Because at its heart, this whole journey, through pots and perfumes, jokes and gilding, pride and privacy, isn't really about toilets at all. It's about people. About the strange, beautiful, and sometimes absurd ways we try to impose order on the inevitable. To decorate the necessary. To find comfort in control. And to leave, even in the most private corners of our lives, a trace of who we were. As you lie there now, letting the past slip quietly into the shadows, think about that final pot. The one at the end of the line. Alone in a storage room. Painted with roses, lined with dust, and somehow still elegant. A relic. Yes. But not forgotten. Because no matter how modern the plumbing, how shiny the faucet, or how silent the flush, somewhere beneath all that gleams the memory of a porcelain bowl with a secret scent compartment and a little hand-painted bird. And it deserves, perhaps, a gentle nod of thanks. And now, dear listener, we come to the final flourish in our long, meandering ode to the Victorian chamber pot. The quiet after the flush, if you will. This last chapter is about the strange little echoes of that once essential object. Because although the chamber pot may be long gone from under beds and beside nightstands, its legacy hasn't vanished entirely. It still lingers, subtly, silently, in the corners of our culture, our language, our design, and even our sense of humor. Tonight, we close this curious journey by exploring the echoes of elegance in unexpected places, where traces of the pot pop up in the modern world, sometimes where you'd least expect them. Let's begin with the most obvious trail, language. Many of the euphemisms we use today to talk about bathrooms, toilets, and bodily functions stem directly from the era of the chamber pot. Phrases like the necessary, the powder room, or even doing your business come from a time when no one dared speak plainly. A chamber pot might be referred to as a night vessel, a bordeloo, more on that in a moment, or simply that which need not be named. Today, we still carry the linguistic shadows of those porcelain delicacies in our coy bathroom code. And yes, the bordeloo deserves its moment in the moonlight. This was a specific type of chamber pot designed for women, elongated, shallow, and shaped to be used discreetly while standing or sitting. Named after a 17th century French priest whose sermons were allegedly so long that women needed a way to relieve themselves without leaving the pew, the bordeloo was both practical and elegantly ridiculous. And believe it or not, modern design students still study it for its ingenuity, ergonomics, and strange intersection of modesty and necessity. Let's move from language to interior design. If you've ever visited a quaint country inn or stayed in a bed and breakfast with vintage decor, you might have noticed a small, oddly shaped bowl on a dresser, filled with potpourri or hand towels. Or perhaps an antique-looking jug and basin combo placed just so near the bathroom door. In many cases, these are repurposed chamber pots, sometimes without even the current owners knowing. What was once tucked under a bed is now placed proudly on top of a table. If that's not a resurrection arc, I don't know what is. You might even own one without realizing. Countless antique shops across Britain, Europe, and North America sell old pots as decorative bowls, vintage wash basins, or Victorian planters. And they're not wrong. But sometimes, a savvy shopper turns over the base and finds a telltale maker's mark. Minton, Spode, Royal Doulton, and then it clicks. That flower-filled centerpiece on your mantel once supported a different kind of bloom entirely. Here's a fringe tidbit for your amusement. In 1993, a popular London florist caused a minor stir by using antique chamber pots in their storefront display. The owner claimed it was a nod to vintage sustainability. The floral arrangements were breathtaking. The pots, immaculate. Only later did an elderly customer gently point out their original purpose. The store kept them anyway. They hold water well, the owner said, and they start conversations. Another quiet legacy of the chamber pot lives on in modern hygiene design. Those smooth, rounded corners on bathroom sinks, the emphasis on easy-to-clean surfaces, odor control, and privacy, all rooted in the same concerns Victorians had, albeit addressed in far more efficient ways. Even the compact shape of some portable toilets today mirrors the dimensions of their ceramic ancestors. The forms we use may be new, but the problems they solve, and the elegance we strive for in solving them, are very old indeed. And then there's the pop culture trail. Films set in the Victorian or Edwardian periods often include sly glimpses of chamber pots, usually played for laughs. Think of the scene in Downton Abbey when a footman discreetly removes a pot from under a guest's bed. Or the brief but memorable moments in period comedies where a well-dressed character discovers a pot where they least expect it. Even children's books set in historical eras sometimes include a chamber pot scene for just the right amount of giggle-inducing gross out. One scholarly debate centers on how we should remember the chamber pot. Some argue it should be discussed openly as a symbol of domestic labor, the quiet, often invisible work of maids and housekeepers who carried, cleaned, and maintained them. To ignore the pot, they say, is to ignore the daily toil of those who kept elite households functioning. Others see the pot as an object of design history, its utility less important than its craftsmanship, its decoration, and its place in the timeline of human comfort. The truth is likely somewhere in between. The chamber pot was, and still is, both a tool and a symbol. A piece of everyday life that carried within it all the contradictions of the age: modesty and indulgence, elegance and embarrassment, art and necessity. Here's your laugh for this final stretch. In 2004, a couple hosting a historical reenactment weekend set out a fully restored Victorian chamber pot in their guest room as part of the decor. A well-meaning participant, dressed in period attire and fully committed to the immersive experience, mistook it for a working fixture. It was only after some very awkward muffled shouting and a hasty clean-up that the hosts decided to add a discreet sign, for display purposes only. A cautionary tale if ever there was one. And yet, stories like that remind us how blurred the line between past and present can be. The chamber pot might seem like a relic of a different world, but it's still with us, in our vocabulary, our habits, and our fascination with how people used to live. We might chuckle at their floral patterns, their perfume compartments, and their monogrammed lids, but deep down, we understand the impulse to make even the necessary beautiful, to wrap practicality in poetry. So tonight, as your room settles into silence and your body grows still, take comfort in this, that you've just spent time in a world that managed, against all odds, to turn even a pot into a canvas. That's what the Victorians did best. They didn't always make sense, but they always made it matter. Every object, every detail, every private act, folded into the grand performance of daily life. And the chamber pot. It was their final secret. Their last whispered joke. A thing too modest to mention, too lovely to ignore.